Welcome to Common Sense Care, parenting your gender-confused child with truth and love. So-called affirmative care is the gender industry's one-size-fits-all answer for all kids and people who suffer with gender identity issues. In no other area of medicine, education, or psychology is one treatment plan assigned to every person. At Partners for Ethical Care, we believe that each person is an individual and should be treated as an individual and given the care that's most appropriate for him or her. So welcome back. I'm Maria Keffler.
And I'm Erin Brewer. And what are we talking about today, Maria?
Today we're talking about autism and gender dysphoria. And this is a really big subject because we know from the research that's out there that kids who are presenting with gender identity issues are overwhelmingly spectrum kids, autism spectrum disorder kids. Some studies are putting it at 60% or higher, and that's huge, but people aren't talking about it.
So, does this mean that kids with autism are more likely to be transgender?
I don't think so. I don't think so. One of the things that people really need to understand is the difference between causality and correlation. And when you're looking at research, when you're looking at data, looking at studies, looking at anything, you can recognize that two things tend to happen together. It's very easy to say that one thing causes another, but you don't really know that from research. So a good example of that might be ice cream and sexual assault. Studies have shown that when consumption of ice cream increases, sexual assault also increases. Well, wait a minute, is eating ice cream causing sexual assault? No, the third factor there is that it's summertime. In the summertime, people consume more ice cream. In the summertime, more people are out and about, and there's more opportunity for sexual assaults. And so it's that third factor that's affecting the other two. But in the research, it just looks like, hey, we're seeing increased ice cream and increased sexual assaults. Maybe one's causing the other. So I think the same thing applies when it comes to gender dysphoria and autism. There's something that is causing autistic kids to present and say, hey, I think I'm transgender. But we don't necessarily know what that third thing is, but we can't say that one causes the other. Does that make sense?
Definitely. And one of the concerns that I've had is transgender activists are sort of celebrating the fact that there are so many autistic kids who are having gender identity issues and making the claim that this proves that it's biological because autism's biological. Therefore, this must be, somehow connected with the biology of autism. And there are all sorts of claims made based on, as you talked about these correlations. But they're not causative. And that's something that people really need to understand. My biggest concern is the idea that there is sort of such a thing as a transgender child, which I reject. I don't think that there is such a thing as a transgender child. There are kids who who are vulnerable to this ideology. And when you look at autism, it's not surprising that there's so many kids being sucked into this ideology because it's sort of the perfect thing for them to explain away their social discomfort, their quirkiness, not fitting in. This kid who's an autistic kid who's been on the spectrum their whole life, really struggling, all of a sudden gets affirmation and affection and attention when they come out and say they're transgender. And so I feel like that is really what's going on, is that there's suddenly an explanation for a child as to why they've been struggling all their lives. And, a community that swoops in and just provides them with all sorts of attention and affection and affirmation. And so that's really where my concern is that activists are celebrating this when in fact it's something that we need to be extremely concerned about.
Yeah, yeah. I think maybe for people who aren't familiar with autism, some of the hallmarks of autism, it's considered a constellation disorder, which means there's like all these different stars or different aspects of it. And it's called a spectrum disorder because not every kid will exhibit every one of these symptoms, but it's sort of a combination of things that make therapists and doctors go, I'm pretty sure this is autism. But the main things that are hallmarks of autism are difficulties with social interactions, difficulties with language, um, and difficulties with sensory issues. So those are kind of the three big things with autism. And all of those will feed right into this suggestion that, oh, something's wrong with you. What could that be? And a lot of kids, and especially girls, tend to be underdiagnosed with autism. There's some theories about why that is, but currently 80% of kids who are diagnosed with autism are boys. And, why is that? Why are we seeing it so more often in boys than in girls? There's several theories, but one that I think holds a lot of water and might explain part of it is that girls tend to be better at social interactions. They tend to be more verbal than boys are. So girls, it's suggested, might be able to hide their symptoms of autism a little bit better than boys do. Girls tend to be better at observing others' behavior and mimicking it, even though maybe they don't really feel that.
When you talked about the sensory issues, one of the things that I think about is, kids who have those sensory issues are uncomfortable with their body as it starts out. So if you've got a kid who's already struggling, feeling comfortable in themselves, and tell them, hey, guess what? You might have been born in the wrong body. What a perfect solution. All of a sudden, oh, now it makes sense. Other people are so much more comfortable with themselves. It's because I was born in the wrong body, without connecting that to being part of the autism spectrum. Another thing that's really a hallmark of autism is this black and white thinking, this very
Mhm.
rigid thinking. And gosh, again, this plays perfectly into the gender ideology, because a lot of these kids, as you said, struggle with social interactions. They struggle to fit in. And so it's not surprising that a girl who's really having a difficult time fitting in says, well, maybe it's because I'm a boy.
Mhm.
Or a lot of these kids also tend to, as you said, their verbal skills aren't as strong. They tend to be more interested in STEM things, science, technology, engineering, that kind of thing. And so for a girl, it's hard to fit in, if you sort of are this nerdy girl who's interested in number patterns and not interested in shopping. And so a girl like that it's really easy to say, oh, well, it's because I'm actually a boy. And especially if you have somebody telling her, well, the reason you're not fitting in, the reason you're uncomfortable with your body is because you were born in the wrong body. You're actually a boy. And it's that nuanced thinking that most of us get as grown-ups that these kids are really lacking.
Yeah, I spoke to one young woman who desisted. She thought that she was transgender for a couple of years, and then she desisted, and she told me she was in school, and she said, I didn't have a friend group.
Mhm.
I didn't really have a posse, kind of. Um, and then when I went to the GSA club, the Gender and Sexuality Allies, so suddenly I had this group of friends and I had somebody to eat with at lunch, and there was always somebody, hanging out with me. And then when I said, I wonder if I might be transgender, suddenly I was cool. I
Mhm.
was popular. Like everybody thought I was amazing.
Ah.
And she recognizes that looking back, that fed both her need for an explanation for why she felt so strange in her own body, an explanation for why she didn't have any friends. Oh, because I'm actually a boy. And it met a lot of temporary needs, which are very common for adolescent kids, but ultimately it was not factual, and she thankfully recognized that before she went down the medicalization path.
Well, and another kind of hallmark of being on the autism spectrum is perseveration, is what I call it. That sort of getting in a rut. So you kind of get a thought, and just having that thought run over and over and over again, and having a hard time dislodging it. And we know that kids who are on the spectrum tend to get kind of obsessed about things. When they're interested in something, they're really interested in it, which can be an incredible gift in some cases. If they're interested in engineering or math, or some aspect of science, it can be really beneficial, this kind of intensity of thought and perseveration. But if they get stuck on a thought that they were born in the wrong body, they can really get into that thought, and it's hard to dislodge that. harder than it is for a kid who's not on the spectrum. So I think that's another way that they're vulnerable to this, is that somebody can feed them that thought. And whereas some kids might, that thought might just kind of percolate through and then leave, a child who's on the spectrum might really start ruminating about it and thinking, gosh, I remember when I was a kid, I did like to play with toys of the other sex. And I had a hard time playing with kids who were my same sex. And they can just spend lots of time going back and thinking about, every single instance where they didn't quite fit in and connect to that to being transgender.
Well, and the black and white thinking can
Mm.
really feed into the perseveration, and they kind of feed on each other. I spoke to one therapist who said for a lot of these kids who are on the autism spectrum, when they get into gender theory, it becomes their obsession.
Mhm.
And if you've ever worked with an autistic child, they do develop these obsessions that can last for years,
Mhm.
whether it's an obsession with Pokemon or an obsession with, yeah, with a certain number theory, or obsession with dragons, or a TV show, a Star Trek, whatever. They will just get into that and learn everything about it. An autistic kid who maybe is obsessed with Star Wars will learn galactic basic language. They really get into it. And so that's also an insidious part of this, is that if they do get introduced to gender theory and something about it resonates with them or feeds something that they're struggling with, that can become their obsession, and they perseverate on that. The black and white thinking, once an autistic person has made a decision, they have put that all in the here's my decision that I've made, and I'm not going that way, I'm going this way. And breaking out of that is very hard for them because they've put all of this energy and thought into making this decision. And if it's a good decision, that's fantastic. But if it's not a good decision, it's very hard to get them corrected again.
And what I'm learning, I've actually done a lot of interviews with detransitioners, and a lot of these kids didn't have an autism diagnosis
Mhm.
um, before they got into this transgender ideology. They were very vulnerable. They were struggling socially, and so they were sucked into it. Many of them went all the way. Puberty blockers, cross-sex hormone surgery, and then they came out on the other end realizing that they were actually on the spectrum, and that they had done all of this as a result of being on the spectrum, and nobody had identified that earlier. So they had gone to therapists who just affirmed and never tried to identify if there were, underlying issues or something like autism that was causing a child to feel this kind of discomfort and disease with themselves. And what a horrible disservice, what a huge mistake. And that's part of the problem with these therapy bans, is that therapists aren't feeling empowered to explore other reasons why a child might be feeling this distress within themselves, and so they just are affirming and moving them forward. And these kids are, I mean, they're young adults now, and they're just enraged because if somebody had diagnosed them and given them appropriate treatment when they were, in junior high school and high school, then they wouldn't have harmed themselves with these transgender interventions.
Yeah. Well, and I spoke with one parent whose child was diagnosed with autism, had an IEP at school for several years, had been diagnosed as a young child. And he said that as soon as his daughter said that she thought she was transgender, nothing about autism mattered anymore at school. And he said, up until that time, everything that happened at school related to that autism diagnosis and that IEP, you know, is what's happening related to her autism, is the accommodation for what she needs fitting with autism. And as soon as she made this transgender identity, the school would not even discuss that it would have anything to do with autism. They would not even brook that idea.
And so even if you do have a diagnosis, it's still really easy to get pulled into this. That's where schools, I think, have really let these kids down, is that rather than helping to identify accommodations that will help them to feel more comfortable, or to suggest that maybe they explore autism, because you know as you said, these constellation of behaviors and symptoms, they're saying, oh, of course you're transgender, and pushing them that direction. One of the things when I've talked to detransitioners about, is that when girls start on testosterone, it gives them a huge high. This is testosterone is actually a controlled substance. It's a very powerful hormone, and so girls who haven't been very confident, who haven't had good self-esteem, who've really struggled, they take testosterone, and all of a sudden they have like a boost in their confidence, in their and but at the same time it shuts down their feelings even more. And one of the problems that people with autism face is having a hard time getting in touch with their feelings. And so it can be hard for them to navigate situations because they have a hard time identifying feelings. So what you're doing is taking a kid who already is struggling with identifying their feelings, and giving them a drug that cuts them off even further from their feelings. And so it's not surprising that when girls first start taking testosterone, they're like, yeah, this is it, because they get this boost of energy, they feel really good, and they get cut off even more from those feelings that can be really uncomfortable, especially in the teenage years.
Wow, I didn't know that testosterone
Yeah.
did that to girls who take it. That's heartbreaking.
Yeah, so
Mm.
I think that there are a lot of issues here. I actually have done a number of interviews. One of them we're going to show here. It's a young woman who was absolutely convinced that she was transgender, and she went to a transgender clinic in Scotland. And unlike the UK, most of the UK and most of Canada and the US and other countries, Australia, this particular clinic did a full assessment of her. And this is something that almost never happens. It's incredibly rare for a child who develops this gender identity crisis to get a full assessment and to identify exactly where their areas are. And so the fact that this was done really saved this young woman's life. It saved her from, she was ready to go on testosterone and go down that path. And luckily, as a result of this assessment, they said, wait a minute, there's more going on here. We want you to go see someone about your autism first, and then we'll see how things go.
Maybe we need to send all these kids to Scotland
Yeah.
to be taken care of.
Yeah, or somehow send our therapists to Scotland to be trained, because they're doing it right and we are not doing it right. Are you still going to the gender clinic?
No, I actually stopped going because I think when I found out I was autistic, because I'd suspected myself for a while, but when I actually got the diagnosis, it kind of just made more sense to me why I didn't feel any kind of, sense of gender fully, and it kind of resolved.
So that was Nem, and she, as I mentioned, is from Scotland. And I just wanted to point out that she was only willing to do this interview anonymously, as many detransitioners feel the same way. They want to get their story out, but they're afraid to put their face out there because of the repercussions. And this again is an indication that this is a really damaging ideology. This has nothing to do with being born in the wrong body or having some kind of medical diagnosis. And it just is heartbreaking to me that these young women want to share their stories, but they're afraid. They're very scared that they might get bullied, they might get fired, they might even get physically assaulted as a result of speaking out about this. So I'm really appreciative that she was willing to share her story, because I think it's so important for people to realize that autism can really present as what they're calling transgender now.
I would almost suggest that any kid who starts thinking or exploring or stating that he or she is transgender ought to be screened for autism. When we're seeing this level, this percentage, 60% and greater, And those are ones who are diagnosed. That's not even taking into account kids who have not received a diagnosis yet. When we're seeing those kind of numbers, I think it only makes sense. That's probably the first thing you ought to look for, is let's find out if you might be on the autism spectrum, because that's a whole different diagnosis. That's a whole different sphere to explore. And if a kid is just being told, yes, you're transgender, they're not getting help. That child's not getting help for any of the other struggles that they have, the verbal issues, the social issues, the processing issues, the perseveration, the black and white thinking. All of those things have therapies and have ways to help that child learn how to cope and how to shore up their weaknesses and develop their strengths, and really get along in society and thrive. But if you're not even addressing those, how can that child ever thrive?
Well, especially when you're putting them on a pathway that is ultimately going to end up with damage to their body. To me, that's really the crux of it, is that they're being denied appropriate services and help, and they're being put on a pathway that's going to end up damaging their body. And one of the techniques, I mean, there are a whole lot of techniques that they've learned work really well with people with autism, and one of them that works well with kids is social stories. And what they do is they work with a child to, if a child has a misperception about something, they help a child, and a lot of times they actually draw it out, and they have like a cartoon. They have the child sort of draw out the situation as it really is to correct the misperception. And this is really effective. This is a technique that works really well with autistic kids. And so in this case, we would have them talk, write out a little story about feeling uncomfortable with themselves, but then in the story talk about why it is that they feel uncomfortable with themselves, and do an ending where they recognize that they actually are not transgender, that they're autistic, and they're born in the right body.
Mhm.
And there are a whole lot of other techniques that can be used to help children with autism function better. They have communication skills classes. They have, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is similar, sort of like an older person's version to social stories, recreating the stories that you tell yourself so that you're more comfortable and function better. And we're denying all of that to kids who are autistic if we affirm the transgender identity and just completely bury that autism.
Yeah. Temple Grandin is a very famous autistic woman. She's done some amazing work. And I think about how when she was a child, she wasn't verbal at all, no interactions. And I mean, she really credits her mother with working with her. And now she's got a PhD. I think she has more than one PhD. She has completely overhauled some of the animal processing industry in the United States. But I would really recommend anything she's written. She's got a great book called The Way I See It, and it's essays on different aspects of her life and different aspects of autism, and they're fascinating. So if you have a child who's autistic, or you suspect they might be autistic, I would really recommend Temple Grandin. Her movie about her life, anything that she's written, it's really illuminating.
Well, and her story especially, I think, illustrates. I have no doubt that if Temple Grandin was a child today, that she would be told she was born in the wrong body, because she's quirky. She likes science. She doesn't dress like a typical female. All of these things which would lead her to believe that she's transgender. And that's what's so frustrating, is that she's a wonderful and gifted scientist. And if she had been pushed to take drugs that harmed her body, surgeries that could potentially kill her, her whole career could have been derailed. And that's my biggest concern about these kids, is that they have incredible gifts that are going to be denied to them because they're being sent down this dangerous pathway.
Yeah, and we know that puberty blockers halt brain development.
Right.
What if Temple Grandin had been put on puberty blockers, and her wonderful, amazing, insightful brain had been damaged? Because that's what it does when brain development is halted or paused. It damages the brain, and that's heartbreaking. And you see so often with autistic kids, they have these super strong strengths and these super strong weaknesses, and they're this mixed bag of strengths and weaknesses. And I mean, we all are, right? We all have different combinations of
Not generally to the extremes, though. I mean, that's
right.
one of the things that's typical about people on the spectrum is that, their gifts are very strong and their weaknesses can be debilitating if they're not properly assessed and if they're not given skills. And that's again, I want to get back to the schools that we know how to help these kids develop skills to so that their weaknesses aren't so debilitating. We know how to help them. And yet, instead of helping them, we're just saying, nope, you're transgender. Go ahead and go down that pathway. And luckily, some of the people who are working with autistic spectrum kids are recognizing this and are starting to speak out and say, hey, we need to stop this. These are kids who need to accept their autism rather than being told they're born in the wrong body.
Yeah. Well, we have a clip from, I'm going to call her Professor Ina because I can't pronounce her last name. And if I try, I'm going to destroy it. And I don't want to do that to her. But she is an autism researcher, and she talks about autism and gender dysphoria.
What is known, what we did find in the publications, is an overrepresentation of individuals with autism spectrum disorders. And of course, that more and more publications are coming in which is published that it is not strange that it occurs in the same person. So the comorbidity of autism and gender identity dysphoria is not so strange. There are, if you look at the explanations, there are various options. Gross gender behavior can be attributed to special obsessions with people. Gross gender behavior can be considered as an OCD, separately from autism and gender dysphoria. He was very autistic. I mean, there was no doubt that he was not. And his problem was totally not that he had a transformation, because he said, I was born in the wrong body. And the only thing I needed is that they correct it. So that was not his problem. His problem was that he could not adapt himself to the daily life situation because of his autism. So I had him in treatment for a period, and after he accepted his autism, he changed and he could cope with his life. And he looked really like a man and not like a woman.
So that was fascinating. I mean, she's recognizing the correlations between being on the autism spectrum and believing that you were born in the wrong body. And I loved what she said. After he accepted his autism, he changed and could cope with his life.
Wow.
And that's wonderful when you embrace truth, when you find out the truth.
And one of the things that just is outrageous to me is that we do have kids with autism. We have kids with developmental disabilities. Imagine if we had the money funneling in to support them that we have to support the transgender ideology. Imagine how much better these outcomes would be for these kids if we had early intervention programs to help them. And instead, we're celebrating this absurdity that you can be born in the wrong body. And it's just infuriating to me. Imagine if they had an autism club instead of a, LGBT, what are they now called? The gender sexuality clubs. I mean, imagine if they had a club for autism and they had the kind of resources that the gender sexuality clubs have. That would be just phenomenal. These kids would thrive. They would get the supportive services they need. So many of these kids, we can, the experts know exactly what the interventions are that will help them, but the schools can't afford to provide these services. Sometimes it's occupational therapy, sometimes it's even physical therapy, social skills training, communication skills. All of these things we can teach these kids if we had the funding, but instead we're all that funding, all those resources are going to help kids think that they're inherently flawed.
Yeah. Well, and we just don't have the political will for it. And going back to the family that I mentioned, whose child was diagnosed with autism, and had an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. Any child who's receiving special ed services in the school gets an individualized education plan or IEP, and it prescribes what needs to happen at school. It has goals. We want the child to, be able to attend 80% of classes without incident. We want the child to be able to attain a C average in all. There's all kinds of goals there. The IEP is what follows that child, and that's kind of the child's Bible at school. And all of the teachers have to refer to that. There's legal ramifications for what happens with that. Well, this child had an IEP, and then after the child said that she was transgender, anything related to autism just went out the door. They just weren't discussing it anymore. And the parents said in one IEP meeting where the parent sits down with all of the teachers and discusses, the social skills teacher said, "Oh, she has made such great gains in her goals. She's done better in her grades this year. She's done better in her social skills. She's done better in her communication. Now that she knows who she really is, she's done so great." And the parent was just furious because that teacher is attributing all of the students' gains to this false ideology rather than this child has had IEP teams on her side for multiple years. She's had parents working with her. She's had therapists working with her. All of these other things that had been in place for so long were just disregarded because, it's because she's
She's
transgender.
finally identified her true self, which is actually someone she's not.
And this child has since desisted, is no longer insisting that she's transgender. So that alone speaks volumes to me that it was not a true statement that all of these gains were because of her transgender status.
Well, and one of the things that when I look at what's happening to these kids, a lot of what's happening is actually, it would be good if it weren't related to this really damaging ideology. So as I said, having, an after school club where these kids could go that would be well funded and promote, them doing activities, social outreach, that would be great if it weren't connected to this damaging ideology. And that's where I get really frustrated, is that again, we could be offering services to kids that we know would be beneficial, but instead we're allowing this very powerful activists ideology to come in and to harm them. And ultimately that's the difference, is that one direction leads to children becoming healthy, becoming more functional, becoming more accomplished. The other leads them to think they're inherently flawed, that there's something wrong with them, that they have to damage themselves in order to be okay. And to me, that's where the dividing line is, and that is very clear. In my interview with Nem, we talked a little bit about something that had made me wonder a lot about some of the things that girls do and possibly that boys do who feel uncomfortable in their bodies. Let's just watch that and see what she has to say.
Autistic people can struggle a lot with puberty, which for me, I really did not like puberty. Like physically, the physical experience of puberty was quite distressing.
All those changes. Well, and that leads me to something that I've had sort of a hypothesis about for a while, and that is people who are autistic often benefit from compression therapy. And I almost wondered if breast binding might be a form of compression therapy. And so a girl who is autistic and feels like she's a boy and then binds her breasts might feel comforted by that simply because of the compression.
Yeah, I honestly think you might be right on that one, because I remember when I was thinking about stuff, I thought, I'll buy a chest binder and I'll try it out. And I really loved wearing it. I felt so much more comfortable wearing it. So I just thought, okay, I'm on the right lines here.
So I think that, Nem and I talked about that, and for people who don't know about binders actually are very tight around the chest. Children who are autistic sometimes really benefit with compression therapy. They actually have vests, compression vests, they have compression blankets, they have compression shirts that they will often recommend to some kids who are autistic because that pressure actually helps them sensory regulate. And they've done a lot of research about this. So they know that this is actually a therapy for some of these kids. There are other kids who are on the other end who are just like constantly like trying to get out of their stuff. So again, this is not a, for all autistic kids, but for a fair number of them, that compression can help. And so it could even be that the breast binding is actually some kind of somewhat therapeutic if it were done with compression rather than with binding that hurts the breast. And that's again, the difference is that a compression shirt provides that therapeutic compression, whereas a binder damages their breasts and potentially inhibits their ability to breathe. I've even heard of ribs being cracked. And so it's sort of, again, the difference between a therapy that's ultimately beneficial versus one that is going to harm them.
Yeah, that was fascinating to me to learn about compression shirts and compression garments. Um, Temple Grandin talked about, and this was back in the 50s or 60s. She saw cattle being put in this metal squeeze box before they were given inoculations for various things. And she asked, why are you squeezing them in there? Because it looked kind of like uncomfortable. But the farmers said, oh, it calms them. It just calms the cattle and they don't mind getting the shots. And so Temple Grandin made herself a squeeze box, and she received a lot of negative attention for that. But I think she may have been the one who discovered that having that squeezing tight feeling does help a significant portion of autistic people. And I had never put that together about that might be why binders are so appealing. Binders are corset-like. If you've ever seen a woman in the movies, like in Pirates of the Caribbean, Keira Knightley is being put into a corset. And I mean, a woman would actually, the person who's helping you dress would like put her foot on your back and like pull, to make you have this small waist. Well, this is like the corset, but lifted up. So it's not your waist, but it's your chest that's getting compressed. And it can cause long-term damage.
Wow.
But yeah, a compression shirt for sensory issues is just a really snug, tight shirt that can give that overall feeling of well-being without the damage that the binder's causing.
So the other thing that we see happening is this, like what has been termed ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria. And I was just wondering if you have any insights as to why so many kids who are sort of going along okay until they hit adolescence, and then they're just completely drawn into this ideology.
Yeah, it's not surprising to me when I look at what's going on in adolescence. Adolescence is a huge time of change. Your brain is changing, your body is changing, your hormones, your social networks are changing. It's a huge time of change and growth. And that's discombobulating for everybody. I don't know anybody who says, oh yeah, adolescence and puberty was a breeze, loved it, wouldn't mind doing it again. I think every single one of us is like, oh, you couldn't pay me enough to go through that period of life again. But when you think about what that's like for an autistic kid, and remember, autistic kids struggle socially with social skills. They struggle with their verbal skills. They struggle with that black and white thinking. They struggle with sensory issues. But a big one is they struggle with change. Autistic kids and people do not like change. They like everything to stay the same. They know it's predictable. They know what's going to happen next. There's no surprises. Transitions can be a disaster for people on the autism spectrum. So imagine what adolescence is like for an autistic kid. It's like a nuclear bomb to your life. Everything is changing. Everything is different. And that's scary and uncomfortable and painful. And then you've got these activists and these programs in schools. And if you walk into a school today, you're likely to see posters in the hallway advertising gender identity classes. Every single class has it in there somewhere. And so you've got these children who are just feeling like their lives have blown up and nothing feels safe and secure and right. And someone tells them, oh, you feel that way because you're transgender.
Yeah.
That's a really quick and easy answer.
Yeah.
And they laugh.
And you know what? We can stop all of this discomfort from happening by putting you on puberty blockers. So we'll just keep you where you are in that comfortable zone rather than having you go through puberty, which might on the surface seem awesome. Like, you know, great, I get to stay where I'm comfortable. But basically what we're doing is inducing a developmental delay and preventing them from going through puberty, which is so important, even though it's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, so much of our growth is predicated on discomfort. We do not grow and change without discomfort. And why would we want to prevent anyone from attaining adulthood?
Yeah.
There's no conscionable, valid reason to prevent someone from attaining adulthood. And that's what puberty blockers do.
Yeah.
It's not a pause.
No.
There's a very short, finite window through which humans pass to go from childhood to adulthood. It's small, it's very time specific, and it doesn't start again. So if a child is on puberty blockers for long enough, they've missed puberty. That window does not open back up again.
You know, the other thing that really struck me as you were talking is that, you know, when I've talked to people who are on the spectrum, another reason that puberty can be so uncomfortable is that suddenly they're getting sexual urges. But at the same time, a lot of these kids are very uncomfortable with touch from other people. Some of them have, you know, revulsion to body fluids. So they might be like very conflicted between wanting to kiss someone, but at the same time being disgusted by it. And that can cause incredible cognitive dissonance. You know, even for those who are not on the spectrum, but you add that kind of difficulty with, you know, the social situations, sensory issues, black and white thinking. It's no wonder they want to pause puberty. I mean, to me, it's like, of course they want to pause puberty. Why wouldn't they want to pause puberty? And then if they can even like modify it so that they get cross-sex hormones, then they don't have to sort of accept who they are. They can take on this different identity and kind of mold who they're going to be rather than sort of accepting who they are.
I think so much of it is escapism. You know, I want to escape puberty. I want to escape this social situation. I want to escape myself. I think we've all felt that at some time. I wish I could just be somebody else. And the gender industry,
Especially in adolescence, even if you're not on the spectrum.
well, yeah, adolescence is a miserable time. Well, and interestingly, I spoke to an autism teacher. She works with autistic kids. This teacher works with profoundly autistic kids, which are a little bit of a different group than we're talking about here. I think we tend to be talking about the high functioning autistic kids who suffer with ROGD. But this teacher told me that with autism, sexual development often is delayed. They don't start thinking about romantic things. She put it, she was so funny. She said, they're so into themselves and they're so focused on what they're interested in. They're not even paying attention to the people around them. And as I was thinking about this, and as I've met various autistic kids, I think when they're very young and in elementary school, they are just so introspective and so into themselves and so into their own stuff. They're not practicing the social skills that most of the other kids are practicing, learning what do I do that makes other people like me? What do I do to create friendships? And then they hit middle school and all these developmental changes happen, puberty is going on, and then they start seeing everybody else, especially in our extremely over-sexualized society. Everybody's having boyfriends and girlfriends, and they see all this happening, and they don't have any experience to prepare them for it. And one thing I've heard from more than one autistic kid, and I talked to a therapist who explained this to me too, because these autistic kids don't have the socialization experience when they're younger, they don't know the difference between friendship and romance. they have not really experienced friendship. And so one girl that I spoke with, a detransition girl, she said that she really, really thought she was a lesbian because she really liked this other girl and really had a crush on her. And the therapist asked, well, what does that feel like? What do you mean? She's like, well, I just really like her. She's really cool. She's fun to hang out with. We laugh a lot together. We like to do a lot of the same things. And the therapist is like, that's friendship. That's friendship. That's not sexual interest. But so many of these autistic kids don't understand that. Or if they've reached puberty and they're not having any sexual urges at all, well, all of society is telling them, well, that means something's wrong with you because everybody needs to have sexual urges. Well, some of us don't get that until later, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's so interesting, that story that you mentioned, because I do think, these kids really do struggle to make sense of the social interactions. I actually had a friend whose son was autistic, and there was this huge milestone when he learned how to lie, because these kids have their development is different. Their milestones are different. And a lot of these kids are so fact-based that they can't really comprehend a lie. And so when this kid finally was able to lie, the mom was like, yay. And most parents are like, but this was a developmental milestone that's different for kids who are on the spectrum. And humor is another one. Sometimes, when they start to understand jokes, that can be huge. And so what we're dealing with is a population that has a very different developmental path than their peers already. And so rather than saying, we're going to put you on this transgender path, let's just focus on helping them to identify where they need to work on skills and provide them with those opportunities, because we know that we can help them. We know that we could provide them social support. There are groups, communication groups, to help teach communication skills, to help teach social skills. Get these kids up to speed with their social skills so that they don't believe there's something wrong with them, so they don't believe they were born in the wrong body.
Yeah. And I think our goal with autistic kids is not to stop them from being autistic. There's some amazing gifts that come with autism. I mean, arguably, some of our most amazing technological developments have come via people who are on the autism spectrum. And I'm not going to name any names, but if you start thinking about some of our tech giants, you might go, oh, aha, I believe that person might be on the
Physicists,
spectrum.
if you look through, physicists, if you look through, I mean, these, you can kind of, once you're familiar with the spectrum, you can kind of go, oh, yeah.
That makes
And
sense.
that's what a lot of us are doing when we see, especially the girls who are just flocking to this transgender ideology, is we're like, wait a minute, these are the girls who are autistic, and now they're being medicated, and it's heartbreaking to me.
We don't want to change them. We don't want to tell them there's anything wrong with them.
No.
We want to help them maximize their strengths and compensate for their weaknesses so that they can thrive in their lives, so that they can hold good jobs, have healthy relationships, function in society in a productive and enjoyable way. We want people to live healthy lives where they can thrive and enjoy who they are. And telling these kids, oh, you're in the wrong body, is telling them, as you said multiple times, telling that they're inherently flawed. And I don't accept that. I don't accept that autistic people are inherently flawed. They just have a different brain than the rest of us. They have a different developmental path. And I think that's to be celebrated. We're not to tell them something's wrong with them and they need to be medicalized.
Right. I totally agree. So we have a question here from a parent. It says, I've heard parents putting something in their child's IEP to prevent the school from presenting transgender information to their autistic child. Can you talk about how to do that? And in addition to this, I just wanted to mention that I've also heard that there are parents who put something in their child's IEP to prevent them from being exposed to a child who is presenting as transgender in the bathrooms and locker rooms, to kind of prevent their child from being influenced by that. And so you talked a little bit about putting something in the IEP. I was wondering, can parents really explicitly say, we do not want our child exposed to this transgender ideology in any of the school situations?
That's a really good question. I know of cases where that has been successful. I'm thinking of one particular parent who her child, I believe, was on the spectrum. I believe her IEP was for autism. Might have been something else, but the daughter already had an IEP. And this mother put in the IEP that her daughter was not to be exposed to, introduced to any sex or gender ideology, any sex or gender training at school. So she was to be opted out of family life education. She was not to encounter this in any classes, and it worked. And that child has since desisted. The mother
Okay.
did this after the child announced transgender identity. Because the IEP is so powerful and
It's a legal document.
it's a legal document, and the school has to abide by what's in there. Now, my understanding is from different parents I've talked to, some schools are better at working with parents on the IEP than other schools are. I've heard some horror stories about parents having to get legal representation in order to get the IEP, where they needed it to be. I've heard other stories where the school is just fantastic and the parent wanted it in the IEP and it went in. So
Another thing to consider putting in the IEP, even if your child hasn't bought into this ideology, is to put that they will be called by their given name and by their sex appropriate pronouns, so that never becomes an issue. So that is, and that is a reasonable case to make. As a parent of someone who's autistic can easily make a case that as we said, these kids are black and white thinkers. They tend to perseverate. We need to help ground them in reality. And one way to do that is to insist on them being called by their birth name and their appropriate pronouns. And that is something you can put in the IEP. And again, it's a legal document. So if the school decides not to follow that, there's legal recourse.
Mhm. Also, if your child does not have a specific diagnosis, maybe he or she has not yet been diagnosed with autism, or have heard of cases where it's so frustrating for parents, they know something's going on with their child, and all the testing, it's like, well, they're a little bit this way, but they don't cross the threshold that we can give that diagnosis, and they've got a little bit of this, but it's not enough we can diagnose. And if you've got one of those sort of amorphous, hard to pin down kids, another opportunity is a 504 form, which is it's accommodations. It's a little less powerful than the IEP, but it's better than nothing. People will use a 504 for, my child just needs extra time on tests.
Mhm.
And so then when he or she is given a test, the teacher knows I've got to give this child an extra 15 minutes. So it's something to explore. I'm not an expert on 504s. I have not used one, but I know that is another avenue that you can look at if for some reason you can't get an IEP for your child.
And actually a 504 can be pretty powerful. My son had a 504 when he was in elementary school. He had some communication difficulties. He hadn't been officially diagnosed with anything, but he wasn't able to eat in the lunchroom with the other kids because of sensory issues. He would get sick, physically sick. And so we wrote up a 504 so that he was allowed to actually eat in the teacher's dining area, or go in the classroom. That he was able to select different places to eat, because the going into the lunchroom was just, he didn't eat, so he wasn't eating. So it was causing big problems. Yeah. And so there are, I think if parents are creative, that they can come up with things. And that it reminds me of the next question we have, which is from a parent who says, I want to pull my autistic son from public school, but most private schools don't offer special ed services. I don't know if I can manage my son's education without special ed services. Are there other avenues for help? Which is a good question. I do wonder about the assumption that private schools don't offer special ed services, because I think that there are a fair number of schools. If a school gets any kind of federal aid at all, including school lunch programs, then they are required to offer special ed services.
Yeah. But I think she's right that schools that do not receive federal funding do not have to. And offering special ed services is a big, it's a big undertaking because there are so many different issues kids can have. You need specialists. If you're going to have autistic kids, you need somebody who understands and specializes in autism. If you have someone with emotional disabilities, you may need to have a social worker on staff. You may need to have a school psychologist. So I think a number of schools just choose not to do that because we don't want to deal with that. And I get it. It's expensive. It's challenging. When you do start dealing with special ed issues, there are a lot of legal ramifications. But yeah, there are schools, and there are special schools specifically for kids with different disabilities or exceptionalities as well. And so you might look into, is there a school that just deals with autistic kids? Those exist. Look into those.
Yeah, and there are also, I know there are some grants and scholarships for kids available, and that might be another avenue to get some help. The other thing is that you can get private services depending on whether or not you have the resources to hire outside people to help your son at a private school, or if you have insurance that will cover. There more and more insurances are actually covering these kind of services for their autistic clients. And so try to explore lots of different avenues, because I do think that there are options. And if worse comes to worse, if your child is at a school that's just, totally bought into this ideology and it's a public school, you can always investigate other public schools in your area and see if there's, a charter school or another school in your area that you feel more comfortable with that has maybe a different administration. And so I think that there are some options. You just have to kind of be willing to go out there and see what's available.
One place you might start is the SEPTA, the Special Ed PTA. A lot of districts have a Special Education Parent-Teacher Association. And the SEPTA organization will at least have some ideas for you or resources, like what is where are some outside resources? What are parents using? Parent connections are just so valuable because maybe you get involved with SEPTA and you talk to another parent who, oh, I've got this great therapist who does this support group for kids like ours. Well, you make that connection. So that's another avenue to start looking for some support.
Yeah. And I think just being aware of the fact that your child is vulnerable. So it's really hard if you're a parent of a child who's on the spectrum. You're already having to deal with some different issues with your child, but then to have to be worried about this, it's kind of heavy. But I do think parents need to be aware that their child is vulnerable, and we know from the numbers, because if up to 60% of children who are identifying as transgender or autistic. And I'm not sure what the percentage of children who are autistic is in the general population, but it's nowhere near 60%, which means that an inordinate number of kids who are on the spectrum are being drawn into this ideology. Well, Maria, this has been kind of a difficult conversation. It's really hard to think that people are actually targeting vulnerable children, but we have to be aware that this is going on.
Yeah, we do. And parents have to realize that they are their children's best defense and protection. And they need to be aware and keep an eye out for what's happening with their kids, especially their special needs kids.
And what are we talking about next week?
Next week, we are going to talk about trauma and gender dysphoria, how trauma can lead to someone believing they might be gender dysphoric or transgender.
Another group of vulnerable children that are being targeted by this ideology.
Yes, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about that, because you have some very personal expertise in that area.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Maria.
We are not doctors or therapists. We are not giving medical or psychiatric advice, and we offer no guarantee of outcomes. We simply want to talk about how to support and love kids using long understood best practices from the fields of psychology, education, and child development. We're glad you joined in our conversation today, and we hope that you took away something you can put in your toolkit for parenting your gender